So just for the course of today's proceedings, my name is Michael Steagall. I'm part of the LaRouche PAC Policy Committee. We work, Dave Christie is also here. He'll be moderating today's program with me. So again, let me welcome all of you to this discussion. For the course of the proceedings today, we've invited a number of guests that have been working with us in some cases for decades. In the course of Mr. LaRouche's efforts to pull together a new development paradigm for mankind broadly. And in doing so, though many of them on short notice couldn't attend directly at the conference today, and perhaps and hopefully in the future they will be able to, and we'll have a continuing discussion with major figures throughout Asia. But we do have then offerings of video presentations, and they're not simply comments or welcoming to the conference. They are, in essence, strategic discussions on the Philippines, on Thailand, on China, and on, what am I forgetting? And Japan, Russia, Greece. Some of them are video statements, some of them are written statements. And so I think it'll be useful for people to get and from India. And so it'll be useful for people to get a sense, though it's sometimes difficult to listen to video presentations. They're not as engaging often as perhaps live presentations are. I would emphasize that they are of a very significant strategic importance. In this organization, whatever it's been named, the International Caucus of Labor Committees. Oh, by the way, make sure you silence all your cell phones. Thank you, Drew, for reminding us. Mr. LaRouche and his associates, people like Mike Billington or Lainey Rubinstein, who are both presenting today. We got a cascading here. That's okay. It's only a reminder. God's sending us a reminder. It's God calling. Silence your cell phones. This is an important discussion. Listen up. So, Mr. LaRouche and his associates have been engaged in a discussion now for decades in places like Thailand. Obviously, Mr. LaRouche was active in places like Mexico, in India with Indira Gandhi. And you'll probably get some of the anecdotes and the history of the development of those discussions, because many of the people, like I mentioned, were involved in this development. And it was really the attack on Mr. LaRouche and our organization by the high-level international financial oligarchy in the 1980s, after the major intervention with Reagan, where a lot of that was pushed back. And what you're now seeing is a lot of the things that we discussed with these institutional figures in Asia. In China, up until 1996, 1997, many of these discussions are now coming back full circle today. And they're coming back with a vengeance, because if they don't implement the policies we had suggested then, there is probably no future for their countries or for the world. And that's a very, very real picture. Imagine if you were in China today, looking at the United States' political and economic circumstances, the political leadership. Imagine if you were looking at Europe and what was happening with the European Union. So put yourself in their shoes, and you'd be very happy, very willing to collaborate with the United States based on the tradition that we represent here in these discussions and in this political fight. So let me see. Hey, Marty, how's it looking in terms of Virginia? Okay. You're going to get a 2-minute warning? Okay. So, Mike, would you like to come up and since we've got some time here, we'll presage the discussion today with Lynn and Helga with a contribution from a significant figure from Japan who has addressed our conference in Germany, and he made some comments for the conference today. So let me introduce Mike Billington.
Hi. Thank you. I'm Mike Billington. I work on the Asia political intelligence in Leesburg, Virginia, our international headquarters, for the Executive Intelligence Review, our weekly magazine. Any of you who don't have subscriptions to EIR, get them today. You can subscribe here. It's a weekly intelligence journal which will provide you with both the motivation and the intelligence that is available nowhere else in the world. I'm going to introduce several of the videos this afternoon. One of our very closest, the idea of the videos is, as Michael said, we want to give you a sense that Mr. LaRouche and his association have been one of the, I think, very important strategic causes of the fact that Asia today is still growing, is still progressing, still believes in progress as we in America once did. And you'll see that this is not just we've decided to develop Asia. This has been in Mr. LaRouche's mind, and Mr. LaRouche thinks in the future. And you'll see that back in the 70s and the 80s, he was thinking and creating the conditions that make it possible for us here in America with this collapsing, degenerate culture, economy, leadership, and so on, to reach out to Asia, to create in America as well as in Asia that potential for saving mankind from the disaster now looming before us. Mr. Kodagawa was in the Ministry of Finance in Japan for many years during the 1990s when the Japanese economy went through something similar to what we did in 2007 and 2008 with the collapse of their banking system. And I'll mention something he wrote about that. He then went to the International Monetary Fund as Japan's representative to the IMF, not working for the IMF, but representing Japan there, which is where we met him in Washington. He met Lin, and at that time, he said, after meeting with Mr. LaRouche, that Lin had answered the greatest question that he had in his adult life, which was, why is America destroying itself? He said he understood that America was destroying itself. He could document it, but he could not, for the life of him, understand why. And it was only after his meeting with Mr. LaRouche, who went through in some detail, as he usually does, the history of the British battle against the American system and the British takeover of American policy after the murder by the British of John Kennedy. And after that, Mr. Kodagawa said, now I understand. This is a war, and it's a war which, unfortunately, America has been losing, and that we can and we must now turn that around. Now, he sent a message, but I'm going to combine a couple of things. Mr. Kodagawa has addressed several of our conferences. He was not able to make a video today, but he has explained in these other conferences, which you can find on our website, how, as the head of Japan's Ministry of Finance overseeing the bank collapse in Japan, he made sure the banks unwound their gambling debts, their derivatives. He made sure that some of the bankers went to jail for their crimes. He shut down a number of banks and then began to issue federal credits into the recovered banking system, which had strings attached. The money had to go into the real economy to rebuild the physical economy. In other words, he did exactly the opposite of what's been done in the United States and in Europe, where the banks are bailed out in order to fund the derivatives. Not a penny of it goes into the real economy. And, of course, there's a too big to jail policy for all the bankers. So I won't go through that part of his message because he reviews that. But I want to actually start by quoting from the Russian magazine Zavtra, which is a journal very close to the Putin administration, one faction of the Putin administration, who are also very good friends of ours, people committed to development and to Eurasian development. And Mr. Kodagawa was in Moscow last month, and the Zavtra asked him for his analysis of the current global strategic crisis, and put this on the front page of their weekly magazine on October 10th. Mr. Kotegawa said, "My experience and research indicate that a financial catastrophe accompanied by a global collapse could happen in the immediate weeks ahead unless the leaders of the major economic powers adopt certain tough measures." This group of economists in Russia consider his warnings and his perspective on Eurasian development to be of the utmost importance for the future of their country and for the world. Then in the October 24th issue of Zavtra, a very widely read journal across Russia, they had an article on a conference that was held in Rhodes in which several of their leading people and Mr. Kotegawa attended. And they say at that Mr. Kotegawa was invited to address the panel at that conference on Eurasian development, which was chaired by academician Sergei Glaziev, who is a top advisor to President Putin. He also, Mr. Glaziev, is the author of a book called Genocide, which is about the destruction of Russia in the 1990s after the fall of the Soviet Union under Yeltsin, when the country was taken over by British financial interests who looted the country, depopulated it, and were it not for Putin and his return to sanity in Russia, the country would have been completely demolished. That book was translated by our organization, by Rachel Douglas, who does our work in Russia, and is available in English, and I encourage you to get it if you want to get a sense of what happened to Russia and why their development today is so crucial. What Zavtra wrote in that article about his presentation is that he warned of a second wave of the global systemic crisis, which would be larger scale, and more severe than the first wave that began with the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers in 2008. In Professor Kotegawa's view, they wrote, the world's major financial organizations are preparing to strike a blow against the weakest European Union members, Greece, Spain, Portugal, and Italy, as well as South Korea. Meanwhile, he said, Eurasia, especially Russia and China, have very good prospects for development. Against a backdrop of stagnation in the world markets, these two countries have an enormous population with a high level of domestic solvent demand. And despite all the differences in their economic models, China and Russia share a need to carry out major state investment programs for development, to provide guarantees to private business within their countries, and to have state banks extend credits to such businesses at low interest rates. Now, as to what Mr. Kotegawa meant when he said that certain tough measures are to be implemented, he said this in his statement to this conference, greeting this conference. He wrote the following: "It is of vital need now that the Glass-Steagall Act be reinstated and investment banks be liquidated as soon as possible to save Europe and to save the world economy. This is a war against filthy bankers who gained a lot of money from gambling and let taxpayers pay their losses." So it is clearly our task here today to carry out that request.
Yeah, sure. I can't barely see them. That's the problem. Hi, Helga. Can you hear me?
Hi. Yes, I can hear you.
Great. Well, let me just give you a short introduction, and you may begin.
Okay.
So, everyone, Mrs. Helga Zepp LaRouche.
Okay, so when we decided to have this conference in Los Angeles, the purpose was to focus on what has to be the way out of this quickly accelerating global financial and strategic crisis, with the specific focus on the Pacific perspective. The reason why this is because the transatlantic region of the world right now is in a terrible crisis, which I will go into in a moment. And, you know, as you will hear at later parts of this conference, we will discuss the World Land Bridge, the new economic platform which would be created through a gigantic qualitative increase in energy flux density, which would be accomplished through the accomplishment of fusion power. But there is actually something has happened this past week which dramatically emphasizes why we have to completely change the present paradigm. On Monday this past week, something quite extraordinary has occurred, namely that in almost all leading Chinese media, there were articles and detailed maps with pictures, photographs, and graphics showing the ability of the Chinese Navy, especially their strategic submarine force, to attack the west coast of the United States. And the message given in these articles and pictures is very clear, that China is ready, that if there would be an attack by the West, by the United States and NATO on China, then this will happen. And then they show that the strategic submarines of China could reach, with nuclear missiles, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Seattle, and they also have accompanying maps which show that the radioactive fallout would basically destroy the entire West Coast into the Midwest, into Chicago. And then they also say that they have about 7,500 ICBMs, which could be sent via the North Pole and reach most population centers in the East Coast. Now, this is not a threat by China, but this is clearly a reaction to what is perceived as an absolute immediate potential danger to the mainland of China, coming from the United States and Great Britain, but also NATO, and the whole global deployment which targets right now Russia and China. Now, most people, and this was published then, I think, on Thursday in the Washington Press, with a detailed map showing these deployments. I don't know if you can see this, but I want to give you a picture of how that looks. Here in the West, you have the fallout curve coming from such an attack on the west coast of the United States. Now, the message, therefore, is quite clear, that China is ready, that they have a strategic force and a second strike capability in case of an attack on China itself. Now, this does not come as a surprise to anybody who has been watching the developments, because earlier this year, there was a quite shocking article in the official journal of the US Air Force, which said that because of the development of nuclear weapons, and especially the targeting and acquisition capabilities, that it would be now possible to attack the nuclear arsenal of any enemy without causing a nuclear fallout, and that therefore the old NATO strategy of mutual assured destruction, whereby the word was that if any side uses nuclear weapons, it will lead to the total annihilation of the entire human population, and therefore the use of these weapons is impossible, that doctrine no longer exists, because you have these technological advancements, and therefore to take out the nuclear arsenal of an opponent is now feasible. Now, shortly, a couple of months later, Professor Etzioni had an article in the official strategic review of Yale University where he wrote with the headline, "Who authorized the preparation for a war with China?" where he says that presently the US military is geared towards a coming war with China, and the facts in the article are all correct except that he blames the leadership of the Pentagon of having designed such a strategy, and basically then he says this needs now an urgent discussion in the Congress, by the White House, and among thinking individuals about what are the consequences of such a policy. Now, obviously, given the fact that the present Pentagon has been the key force trying to prevent an escalation, like in the recent example in Syria, the blame on the Pentagon is misleading, but obviously that is presently the US policy. Now, this trajectory of a confrontation, including that of nuclear weapons, has been going on for quite some time. My husband, Mr. LaRouche, who will speak to you shortly, points to the fact that this direction has been chosen since and with the assassination of President Kennedy, and it was only very briefly interrupted when, in the beginning of the 80s, it was very clear that this already was bringing up the immediate danger of World War III, because the medium-range missiles of both NATO and the Warsaw Pact were in short distance to each other. The Pershing II and the SS-20 were facing each other in Central Europe with only a few minutes warning time. And because of such short warning time, these missiles at that time were on launch on warning, which meant that if one superpower would launch a missile or would have the perception that the other one would have launched it, they would have to basically send the entire arsenal because the warning time was too short. So this was the hair trigger annihilation danger, which was the context for Lyndon LaRouche to develop the SDI, or what became the SDI policy, which was then in March '83 adopted by President Reagan, and which was on the table for a couple of months as a real war avoidance option. But then it was rejected first by the Soviet government, but also by the Bush-Kissinger faction in the Reagan administration. So that chance was thrown out of the window. And then, naturally, when the Soviet Union collapsed between '89 and '91, there was the real possibility for a peace order, because at that point, no enemy existed any longer. Communism was defeated. But at that point, unfortunately, the British, in the form of Margaret Thatcher, and the United States, through the person of Bush Sr., and the neocons, they decided to use the collapse of the Soviet Union to build a global empire based on the Anglo-American special relationship. And that is when the present trajectory towards this war danger was accelerated. What you saw in Europe was the NATO expansion eastward, together with the EU expansion, which Russia correctly judged as an encirclement of Russia. To this belongs, for example, the establishment of a US defense missile system in Poland and Czechia, which Russia has warned against. They will not allow the completion in the last phase 4, because that would then take out the second strike capability of Russia in case of an attack. And they said they will not allow it. But then you have to see all the other steps of such a global policy, like, for example, you have the the air-sea battle, or what Obama calls the Asia pivot policy, which is an encirclement of China. And if Australian politicians are quite open to say that Australia or certain people in the Australian government see a coming war with China as inevitable, and that others are criticizing that the entire continent of Australia has become nothing but an airbase of the United States for such a war, then you see that the present reaction of China to all of these deployments is just a reaction, because both Russia and China do feel encircled, and they are. I mean, even honest military from Europe or the United States admit that. So if you look at that immediate danger and the fact that we are sitting on an absolute volcano in terms of the immediate danger of a blowout of the financial system of the transatlantic region, which naturally is not limited to Europe and the United States, given the role of the dollar in the world. So then basically you can actually see what is going on. Now I should note that what we have right now is the point which Lyndon LaRouche predicted would happen after Nixon decoupled the dollar from gold on the 15th of August 1971, where the fixed exchange rates were abandoned, where the old Bretton Woods system was eliminated through Nixon. And Lynn at that time said, if we stay on this course, then we inevitably will go to a new depression and the danger of a new fascism. And that is exactly where we are today, because only the blind can deny the fact that we are confronted with the danger of a fascist dictatorship in Europe and in the United States. In Europe, it is very clear that that process, which started with the introduction of the euro, the Maastricht Treaty in '92, Maastricht, which was, the imposition of the European currency union. No people of Europe was asked if they liked that, but it was meant to transform the EU into the regional expression of this Anglo-American dominated empire, which basically, if you replace the word globalization for the totality of the central banks, the investment banks, the hedge funds, the private equity funds, the insurance companies, that which you can call the financial oligarchy today, then you can actually see that that oligarchy being confronted with their demise, because we are sitting on a volcano which could explode any moment, whereby the collapse of the Lehman Brothers in 2008 would just be the proverbial peanuts. And right now you have both the financial institutions of Europe and of the United States preparing high gear to somehow unload the cost of this present situation on the population. Now, the paradigm shift, which was introduced in '71 by Nixon to accelerate the shift away from speculation, away from production to speculation, was accelerated with the collapse of the Soviet Union, where globalization deregulated the markets completely by only having the idea of money makes money, completely disemphasizing production and the real economy. And now this situation has reached a point where this system is so indebted, and that after the 2008 crisis and the process of bail-ins, private gambling debt was completely transformed into public state debt. Now, all the top bankers, the too big to fail, know that their system is to blow. And they are preparing high gear to have the following set of measures. They want to continue quantitative easing, printing money, which is threatening in the short term a blowout of the hyperinflationary blowout of the system, which you already can see in the form of high prices in food, in energy, in gasoline, and the real inflation for the general population, which is not belonging to the super rich, is already between 20 and 30%. That bailout continuation and quantitative easing, however, should be combined with a bail-in. Now, that is the Cyprus model, and that if that is applied for all of Europe and the United States, which is what are the laws written already, then you would have the Cyprus model or the Detroit model applied to all of Europe and all of the United States. Now, this is shortly about to happen. For example, Münchau, a columnist in the Financial Times and Spiegel Online, had an article last week where he said the SPD in Germany, which is in coalition discussions with the CDU to form a new government, they should not take the finance ministry because they should be happy not to take the blame for the coming blowout which will occur. Either way, either you will have a bail-in, a haircut, and then you have the Cyprus model applied on all of Europe, or the Eurozone will collapse and you have a disintegration that way. Now, the oligarchy, which is in personnel in large part identical with the too big to fail banks. For example, if you look at the CEOs of the hedge funds, who have 80% of them their headquarters in London, many of them are high nobility. So you cannot separate the British Empire monarchical system from the financial oligarchy, and that oligarchy is absolutely determined to turn the clock back. They want to go back to feudalism. They want to have an elimination of republicanism. They want to have no nation state. They want to have cities and regions and backward population. But most of all, they want to reduce the present world population from 7 billion to somewhere around 1 billion or less. Now, this is well documented. This is absolutely not debatable. But then you look at the present medicines which are applied to the crisis in the United States and in Europe, and you see that the economic policies prescribed are genocide. What the Troika has been doing in Greece is genocide. They have increased the death rate, they have increased the suicide rates, they have shortened the life expectancy, and the same has been happening in Cyprus, in Italy, in Spain, in Portugal. And if the bail-in would be implemented, it would apply in all of Europe. And that is what is happening in the United States. Obamacare is not what some foolish Western medias in Europe are still peddling. It is not meant to provide every American with medical care, but it is eliminating entire categories of people to be treated, of patients to be treated, sicknesses which are no longer covered by the policies of the health insurance. And as it now turns out, that already in 2010 the administration knew that 93 million people would be thrown out of the health insurance through Obamacare. Now, if you combine that with the increase of poverty in the United States, 48 million Americans are living on food stamps. I mean, that is a large number of people. That is almost more than half of entire German population. And now, with the new cuts, 5 billion are supposed to be cut from the food stamps for these 48 million people, which means that, for all affected, the food stamps of 1 week per month will go, and many people will not make it. So what we are looking at is an unbelievable world crisis. So therefore, I think we need to absolutely accelerate our efforts to wake the population up about these twofold dangers, the danger of an immediate thermonuclear war and the danger of a fascist dictatorship implementing fascist economic policies, which will not work on top of it. And we have to fight to get the alternative on the table. Now, the good thing is there is an absolute alternative in place. The alternative would be that we immediately implement Glass-Steagall. As you know, we have a growing movement for Glass-Steagall in the United States. We have a massive discussion in Europe about Glass-Steagall. In the Italian Parliament, we have 5 bills introduced. We have about 500 mayors in France. We have an increasing number of mayors and city councils in Germany who are fighting for Glass-Steagall. Now, if the United States would implement Glass-Steagall, Europe would have no other chance than to follow immediately. But we need a global Glass-Steagall, because Glass-Steagall is only the first step. The next thing is we need to go to a credit system in the tradition of Alexander Hamilton's National Bank. That means we have to, in Europe, to go back to sovereign control over the national currencies, get rid of the euro, which is a failed experiment, and then have in each nation, in Asia, in Europe, in the United States, in Africa, Latin America, national banks which together agree on a whole set of international projects, which would be around the World Land Bridge, Navapa, the Bering Strait Tunnel, the Kra Canal, the Eurasian Land Bridge, large water projects for Africa, a water and desalination project for the Middle East, and many other projects which we will talk about in the course of this conference. But it would immediately set up a network of credit agreements, long-term credit agreements, based on the national banking system of each sovereign countries to jointly finance these long-term projects, which would have a duration of 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And we could get out of this crisis immediately. Now, we have been fighting for this since 1989. When the wall came down, we proposed the productive triangle for Europe first. Then, when the Soviet Union collapsed, we expanded that to the Eurasian Land Bridge. And in the meantime, with some ups and downs, now the Chinese President Xi Jinping has proposed the new Silk Road to be the Chinese policy for the building of the new Silk Road throughout Central Asia and beyond. He has called for the maritime Silk Road together with Indonesia, and many, many other countries are ready to cooperate in such a proposal. But it needs to be boldly put on the table, and it can only succeed if we mobilize the population, at least the moral people, the 5% thinking people, the people who regard themselves as world historical individuals in this absolute incredible moment of crisis of civilization. But I'm absolutely certain that this effort will only succeed if we get rid of the culture of globalization. Because globalization is not only a system which throws people into slavery and kills people, but it is a system which goes along with a culture or counterculture which is exactly in the footsteps of the Roman Empire, where the Neros and the Caesars were using the bread and circus to dumb the population, to turn them into bestial people participating in the crime committed in the circus. And that is exactly what the global culture is. If you look at the so-called pop culture, if you look at the Madonnas and Lady Gagas of the world, you see that it is completely satanic. It is pornographic, it is bestial, it has an image of man as an absolute depraved creature. And if we do not reject that kind of image of man, which is also expressed in the video games, in most of the popular entertainment, then I don't think we can mobilize the moral integrity to effect the necessary change to save civilization. And therefore, we absolutely have to have a renaissance of classical culture, of classical music, and of classical poetry in the best forms expressed by the Greek tragedians, by Shakespeare, by Schiller, by Shelley, Keats, and such people. Because we have to uplift ourselves and reject everything which has to do with pleasure in the here and now, based on these depraved cultural entertainments. And we have to make the next paradigm shift into a new paradigm, a new renaissance of civilization, whereby man is true to his identity as a creative human being. And the only way how we can nourish that is by studying and enjoying the great classical compositions, especially in music, but also in poetry, drama, architecture, painting. But obviously, classical music is the international language which goes directly to the soul of the people. Now, I do not know if we can save civilization. I must say, having been in politics together with Lynn for the last 40 years, I must really say that the civilization hangs by a thread. The danger that we may not exist as a civilization and that all the beautiful works of art, all the struggles of so many noble individuals were all in vain, and that mankind will annihilate itself because we were not capable to get rid of this bestial oligarchy which has mankind in its grip right now. That chance is unfortunately extremely big. So therefore, let's really go into this conference with the solemn commitment and beyond that we will mobilize the American population to say no to these policies, to effect the kinds of changes in the Congress, because the Congress is the one place which could affect, the necessary adjustments, concerning the government, concerning defending the Constitution, of upholding the beautiful idea of the American Revolution and the paradigm which goes with that. But at this point, it really requires a miracle. So since I believe in miracles, but only those which we do ourselves, let's become the kind of warrior angels which is needed to cause this change.
So I think what we'll try to do is, Helga, we'll take a couple of questions for you now, and then we'll have Lynn, and we can take questions for then both of you. Does that work for you? Okay, great. So are there a couple of questions? So if you come up to the mic here and speak, so that way she can hear you and see you. I'll take one more question. If there's a couple, we'll take them, and then we'll move on to Lynn.
Hi, my name is Sean. I'm the founder president of the Evergreen Award and licensee for evacuative transport, ED3. Also, I'm a founder member of the President Obama's Organizing for Action and climate leader at Vice President Al Gore's Climate Reality Project. First of all, I thank Lena Platt for inviting me to this conference. And I have discussed many things and exchanged views with her related to the theme of this conference by telephone before coming here. Based on my discussion with her, I would like to raise the following questions with regard to the US policies of fiscal, monetary, trade, and foreign, since US economy is the key to the global economy. Overall, the US global trade is deficit. Its trade with the top 16 Asian Pacific countries is to a deficit balance of $3,234 billion from 2001 to 2010, as per the information of US Department of Commerce. The countries are South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Australia, Malaysia, India, Philippines, Thailand, Indonesia, New Zealand, Pakistan, Vietnam, Japan, China, and Bangladesh. Based on the information, there are many questions arise. Why the US have not taken any serious action all these years to improve its trade deficit? Is it because it doesn't care the deficit trade balance, since it has the power to print unlimited money, where the US has been accepted, dollar has been accepted worldwide as the single global trade currency? Why US doesn't promote its trade through its diplomatic missions around the world, like other countries such as China, Australia, New Zealand, and Sri Lanka, where they often organize trade fairs, wine tastings, tea tastings, etc. Why USA concentrates more on internal politics rather than concentrating with bilateral relationship? 2, in 2008, some of the banks were bailed out by the US federal government, where they were in the verge of bankruptcy due to mortgage crisis. As per the Federal Reserve Bank's bulletin, loan loss reserves and unearned income, the past due, is 158 billion, and the bailed out amount was 204.8 billion. Household loss to this crisis were 1.2 million. Actually, the federal government has bailed out those banks on behalf of the defaulted mortgage owners for their defaulted payments, and the banks should have handed over their houses back to them upon the bailout. But the banks were tricky and unfair on that occasion, where they have cheated the federal government as well as their customers and made double money or profit without handing over the houses back. As per the reliable information, the mortgage owners who have been paid over a period of 5 years also been. We have other people that are going to want to have questions. Just 2 minutes, okay, yes. Okay. Based on this information, again, there are many questions arise. What is the US federal bank's role over the banks and financial institutions? Does the US Federal Reserve Bank supervise the activities of the banks and financial institutions regularly? Why the Congress and Senate couldn't analyze the impact before passing the bill? Who is responsible for 1.2 million people who went to the street by losing their homes under this trick? Further, the US GDP is approximately 15 trillion, and the public debt is approximately 16 trillion, and it's marketable. This is the question I'm asking. This is the policy. What I'm saying, we need policies. Yes. So it's my opinion that there should be a change in US policies on monetary, fiscal, foreign, in order to have a balanced approach to strengthen its economy. Otherwise, it will have a big negative impact in the future, since BRICS countries are strategically moving forward against the weakened US monetary, fiscal, and foreign policies.
Yes, I think the only way one can understand this behavior, which obviously is violating US interest. I mean, why is the United States pursuing an economic and financial policy which is clearly against the interest of the US itself, of the US population, as much as it is against the interest of these countries you named? And the only way to understand it is that the present dominant policy of the US and the Anglo-Dutch empire is globalization. That is, you cannot understand it from the standpoint of a national interest of the United States, but that the present too big to fail banks, the 28 or so too big to fail banks internationally, constitute a financial oligarchy which believes that their richness does not come from production in the real economy, but it comes from controlling and manipulating the global financial markets. Now, you have seen that in the form of the LIBOR manipulation, where the 28 or 24 largest banks in the world for 2 decades or more manipulated the foreign exchange rates, cheating their customers by 3-digit billion amounts, if you control the international markets, you can make an enormous amount of money by playing the markets, by manipulating the markets, while production is collapsing. And they intend to keep that system. They want to keep the system of derivatives, of creative financial instruments, because, as you can see, even after the collapse of 2008 and the continuation of the bailout policies, the number of millionaires and billionaires in the transatlantic region has become larger. There are more millionaires and more billionaires, but there are also a lot more poor people in every country, in Europe, in the United States, in Brazil, in Africa. The gap between rich and poor as a result of this policy has absolutely increased. So the only answer how to remedy that is that the United States must become back a nation and not adopt the British Empire doctrine as the platform for their policy. The battle in the United States right now is between running the world as an empire based on the Anglo-American special relationship, a policy which repeatedly was introduced in America, starting probably with Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. But America must go back to the idea of the American Revolution, the American Republic, the American Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and above all, the foreign policy approach of John Quincy Adams, who believed that the world can only be peaceful if there is an alliance of perfectly sovereign nation states working together for the common aim of mankind. Now, the kind of policy what we are proposing with NAWAPA, which would be the largest water management project ever in the tradition of the TVA of Roosevelt, immediately you would create 6 million productive jobs. You would basically then have a motor to gear up the US economy domestically by bringing the idle water from Alaska and Canada along the Rocky Mountains all the way to Mexico, to in the desert states along the Rocky Mountains. And you would start to build up the domestic market in the United States. Now, the danger right now is, unlike in the Depression and the big crisis of the 30s, that because of the globalization and the outsourcing of a lot of production, by turning a lot of countries of Asia into cheap labor markets for the US domestic markets, that a lot of the productive capacities which existed in the time of the 30s no longer exist. There are not so many family farmers as were in the 30s. There are not so many Mittelstand, middle-level industries, because a lot of industrial production has been outsourced. So therefore, a large project like NAWAPA and affiliated projects is absolutely crucial for the survival of the United States. Now, obviously, we need to build up the domestic economies of every single nation state around the world. And then, if you go from the assumption that the only source of wealth is not the manipulation of free trade or the prices market structure of the global markets, but that the only source of wealth is the creative power of the own citizens. Therefore, any country which is concerned about the well-being of its citizens and its economy must think to upgrade the education level, to upgrade the creative powers of their own workforce, and that can only be accomplished through science driver programs like what we are proposing now with the increase in the energy flux density in the realm of a crash program for fusion power. That same problem of upgrading the population, of making them more productive by increasing their creative powers, that is a problem which poses itself for every single nation on this planet. For the United States, emphatically, because the education level has been collapsed since decades. It is an absolute urgency for China. If China wants to develop the interior regions it must absolutely transform a rural population into an educated labor force. Naturally, the same problem exists in Latin America, in Africa, and even in countries like Germany. Because of the green paradigm, the cognitive power of the population has been almost devastated. A greenie is a stupid person because they believe in a cultish idea of a world which does not exist. What we have to do is we have to bring the production and the politics into cohesion with the laws of the universe. And the laws of the universe are not entropic, they are definitely anti-entropic, and human creativity is what corresponds to the laws of the universe. And we have reached a point in human civilization where either we bring our policy, our economic policy, our social policy into cohesion with the laws of the physical universe, or we will not make it. So I think that right now the answer is, we have to build up the productive powers of the United States, and that way, the trade deficit would quickly vanish, because then you can organize both your domestic affairs and the relation among countries in a rational form and actually, be human.
Thank you very much. So before I take the next question, let me just say, when a person is asking the question, we very much appreciate your question and participation. We don't need any comments from the audience. We will be moderating. We do want substantial discussions and questions, but obviously time is limited, especially with Mr. and Mrs. LaRouche. So if you can, make your question as succinct as possible, but we appreciate the participation, absolutely. So let me take one more question from Mrs. LaRouche. Please come up and introduce yourself.
The name is Eric Levitt, and I'm a book author. Mrs. LaRouche, I can't thank you enough for noting the culture war against our civilization, which really kicked in gear in the 60s and devastated that decade. As a lifelong musician, and more recently a screenwriter, may we add classic film to your list of classical music, classical literature, classical poetry. We know that reforming Hollywood is hopeless, and but happy to say, and I'll leave this to you, happy to say that I am working with a number of people to change not Hollywood, but the direction of the film and entertainment industry. So may we include classic films on your list, and I believe that will really help further change our culture for the good.
I can fully agree with you, because classical drama, for example, historical dramas, have the same function like a good classical movie, because when Schiller wrote his treatise about theater as a moral institution, he said that in that sense, the film is just a way of making the stage of the theater more easy to be communicated to larger numbers of people, while it is naturally a different form of medium, and if it's good, a different form of art. Nevertheless, it addresses potentially the same thing, namely it can strengthen the power of imagination. And given the fact that most people cannot imagine the future, most people have absolutely no way of even knowing if, when you see a train running, crashing against the wall, which is what the present strategic situation is, most people say, I cannot believe you, this has not happened yet. These people up there, the powers to be, they will never let it happen. And, it has to do with the fact that people are believing in their sensuous experience and experience of the past. They cannot imagine, neither in the negative way, what is the outcome of the present policies, nor can they imagine what would be a vision of mankind for the future, which would be in cohesion with the dignity of man. Now, great classical drama and poetry, but especially drama, and potentially, naturally, good films, would inspire people to imagine to imagine scenarios, to imagine the large issues of mankind, as Schiller would used to call it. Something, you have a normal salesperson or a barber or an engineer, and they're doing their job, but they have not the time, because they have to take care of their livelihood every day. They have not the time to think about a vision, how should mankind look in 100 years from now or 1,000 years from now. And it is the work of the poets, the film writers, the artists, the drama writers, to have the kind of vision which ennobles man, which enriches his imagination power, because it is that imagination power to think an hypothesis, to think something which has never been thought before, something which is a new idea, a new necessary idea for mankind to go to, but it requires that kind of inspiration. Now, I think that great film would have a wonderful work, because in the time of modern communication, you could reach every village, every part of the world which is now affected with I'm sorry. I'm sorry. That happens. So I'm sorry. Here I was reminded of globalization. No, but what is now polluting? You have TV sets in villages in Africa where people have nothing to eat, but they have a disgusting video set with disgusting movies in it. You could transform the same thing for a good purpose. You could do so much with modern means, and classical film was once an art, and I can say that in my view, since the 50s, there are few exceptions, but they are mostly, in somewhere in film festivals which are way off the mainstream. There are some decent films even nowadays, but if you think back, films used to have a plot, which was, like a plot which would develop and almost be like a musical composition, where there would be a thorough composition, a lot of tension, a lot of resolution, a lot of lawful punctum saliens development in the film, and then the film would come to a surprising or satisfying end, and the person who has watched that movie would go and be elevated and inspired even for hours or days after seeing the movie. Now that has completely disappeared. You have soap operas which go on and on forever, for decades, and there is no rhyme and no rhythm. It just keeps going, and it dulls people, and it makes people addictive, because they almost live more in these soap operas than in the real world. And that has a method. So I welcome your initiative, and I think this is absolutely crucial, because we need creative people to participate in all possible fields to get the poor civilization from its present course. So I will in the future include classical film absolutely in the list of my proposals, and I'm looking forward to hear more from you.